Welcome back everyone, it is Eric from Candy, and today we're going to be kicking off the first Scarlet and Violet deck profile of the channel with the brand new Miraidon EX, which is pretty fitting since this is, at least tied for being the most hyped new deck that we're going to be getting from the brand new Scarlet and Violet set. Now, that being said, I have actually been experimenting with a couple of different ways to take this deck list. So at the end of this video, if you're still hungry for some more Miraidon content, I actually did drop a bonus article over on Patreon detailing some additional card inclusions, tech cards, etc. that you can potentially alter the list with. And before we get into the deck, just a quick heads up, if you're thinking about picking up any Scarlet and Violet cards for yourself, friends of the channel over at flipsidegaming.com are still taking pre-orders on sealed product. Just use coupon code RARECANDY to save 10%, and you also get free shipping. But if Flipside is out of stock by the time you see this video, you can also use my affiliate link with TCGPlayer. They'll show you the next cheapest online listing, and it does really help support the channel too. Links to all these will be down below in the description. But with that being said, let's jump into the deck list. So of course, up first we do have 4 copies of the brand new Miraidon EX. Much like Pokemon V, this guy's going to give up 2 prizes whenever it's KO'd, but it has this ability that says once during your turn you can search your deck for 2 basic lightning Pokemon and put them on your bench and shuffle your deck. So this is fantastic. As you'll see, we are playing Regieleki VMAX alongside it, and we really do need to get a couple of these into play. So Miraidon EX just kind of sets up your board for you by itself as long as you can get one of these into play, because you can actually use this ability to grab maybe a Regieleki plus a second Miraidon, and then use that second Miraidon to grab maybe 2 more Regielekis. But then Miraidon does have an attack of its own for 2 lightning and a colorless, does 220, and this Pokemon can't attack on your next turn. 220 is an okay amount of damage that is going to knock out a lot of the basic multi-prize Pokemon, but we're definitely coming up a bit short to one-shot a lot of the multi-prize evolution Pokemon, and that of course is where Regieleki VMAX is going to help us out. But before we get to the VMAX, I actually do want to point out Regieleki V is a surprisingly decent attacker in certain matchups here. Its first attack for a lightning does 30, and you switch it with one of your bench Pokemon. So while that doesn't seem like a ton of damage, if we have a few VMAXs in play buffing its damage output, this can actually be a great way at one-shotting some low HP Pokemon in the format like Cramorant. So basically, it's a pretty good attacker against the Lost Zone based decks, and we actually do have a really good Pokemon that we can switch into as well, which we'll get to shortly. But more importantly, we do have our 4 copies of Regieleki VMAX as well. So the whole reason we're playing Regieleki is for this ability. It's going to buff our damage from our basic lightning Pokemon by 30. So now suddenly that 220 damage attack on Miraidon, with a couple of Regielekis in play, we can actually one-shot, of course, Pokemon V-Star and Stage 1 Pokemon EX, but we can actually even creep into one-shot territory on Pokemon VMAX and Stage 2 Pokemon EX. Regieleki also does have free retreat, which is great for a deck like this because our energy acceleration is based around accelerating to bench lightning Pokemon, which makes this card such a good pivot option for after something gets knocked out. We can promote this guy with free retreat, accelerate energy onto our bench, then freely retreat into our attacker of choice. And honestly, the attack on Regieleki VMAX isn't that awful either. Even though you can't buff its damage output with your VMAXs, it is still nice to have another attacker you can use with a little bit more HP to deny a one-shot from your opponent. Up next from there, we have 2 copies of the brand new Klefki, which might look a little bit odd at a glance, but hear me out. So Klefki has this very strong ability that, while in the active spot, it shuts off the abilities of all basic Pokemon in play. So you might think, well, that kind of sucks. I mean, we're going to be shutting off our own Miraidon EX. And while yes, that is true, we really just need Miraidon's ability for a single turn to get set up, and we can always just retreat into Klefki after we've already used it. So this can definitely be a good card for the mirror match to just throw into the active spot if you're going first to end your turn. But also this cripples a couple of the most powerful engines that we have in the game, with cards like Genesect V and Comfey being completely shut down by this thing. I do think Lost Zone based decks are going to be one of this deck's less favorable matchups, and if you're not playing a way to deal with those, I think you're going to be in for a rough time. And to round out our Pokemon line, we also have a copy of Drapion V just to help even the playing field a little bit against Mew VMAX. Even though it's already possible to take a one-shot on Mew VMAX, it is kind of tricky, especially if they do have OHKO in play. It kind of forces you to have 4 damage modifiers. But if you have Drapion in the mix, things become a little bit easier because you can take your first Mew KO with your Drapion, and while you're doing that, you can be building up to a second big attack to follow that up after they return KO your Drapion. But that's going to be it for the Pokemon in the deck, guys. I know it doesn't look like much, but bench space is a premium here, and very frequently you're not going to have the bench space to dedicate to things like Burrell, Radiant Greninjas, Luminions, because that is going to eat into your max damage output with your Regielekis. But looking over at our supporter cards, we have 4 copies of Professor's Research, definitely after rotation the best draw supporter we're going to have. Just discard our hand and draw 7. We also have 2 copies of Judge in the deck as well, so I know it's not a complete Marnie reprint, but it kind of fills that same sort of role that we have here. Both players shuffle their hands into their deck and get 4 each. I will say in my experience, the draw power for this card does feel a little bit weak since we don't really have an engine outside of our supporters to see additional cards, but the hand disruption aspect is really good against a couple of matchups in particular, so sticking with Judge for the moment. From there, we also have 2 copies of Arven, which is a brand new supporter card from Scarlet and Violet. It says we can search your deck for an item card and a Pokemon tool and put them into our hand. Now, one of the things that I do like about Miraidon EX is that it kind of sets up your board for you. And really after turn 1, you're basically just looking for ways to accelerate energy or do more damage. And Arven can find you those exact cards that you need in the mid game to make that happen. Up next from there, we have 2 copies of Serena, as well as 1 copy of Boss's Orders. So I have kind of been playing around of the split of both of these cards. At different points I've had 2 Boss, 1 Serena, but right now I am favoring the 2 Serena just because one of the big issues with this deck is that you don't have an engine outside of your draw supporters. And so by playing the 2nd Serena instead of the 2nd Boss, it just gives us more outs to a physical draw supporter on turns where our hand might otherwise be dead had that been a boss. But for our stadium of choice, we have 3 copies of the brand new Beach Court, or somewhat new I should say. It's basically a reprint of Sky Arrow Bridge, but it's just as good. It's going to reduce the retreat cost of all basic Pokemon by 1 colorless energy, which is perfect because everything in our deck outside of our pesky Drapion V, if we're unfortunate enough to start with this, has just a 1 retreat cost or less. So this makes the turn 1 Klefki play a little bit easier since we can just freely retreat into it if we do have this thing up. Like I mentioned already, we're also reliant on accelerating energy to bench Pokemon specifically in this deck. So if we don't yet have a Regieleki VMAX, Beach Court can still turn our other Pokemon with a 1 retreat into a nice pivot Pokemon for in-between knockouts. And next up, we have 4 copies of the brand new Electricity Generator. So this is really the card that makes the whole deck tick. We get to look at the top 5 cards of our deck and choose 2 Lightning Energy and attach them to our benched Lightning Pokemon in any way that we like. So as you can see, we're not playing Flaffy, we're not playing Raihan or anything like that. So this is the way we are going to be powering up our Pokemon. So getting into our Pokemon search options, we have 4 copies of Ultra Ball, as well as 3 copies of the brand new Nest Ball. So as you can see though, I am going to be leaning a little bit more heavily on Ultra Ball than the Nest Balls, just because Miraidon can already search out a lot of our basic Pokemon for us, and Ultra Ball allows us the flexibility of grabbing a Regieleki VMAX, whereas again, our Miraidon cannot. But of course, Nest Ball, if you're not familiar with it, it's a reprint of an older card. We can search out a basic Pokemon from our deck and put it directly onto our bench. Next up from there, we have a copy of Switch Cart in the deck. We switch our active basic Pokemon with one of our bench Pokemon, and we heal 30 from the Pokemon that was switched. And the 30 heal is actually pretty relevant, especially against Lost Box in particular, just because Cramorant can hit for the perfect 2-shot against your Miraidons. And after they swing for 110, being able to heal 30 actually forces them into a 3-shot at that point. From there, we also have a copy of Escape Rope as well. We switch our active and our opponent also switches their active. So this can especially be good if we're going against another deck that is playing their own Klefki and we want to be able to use our Miraidon, while Escape Rope can be a way that we can force that Klefki out of the active to activate our abilities. And for our last item card, we have 1 copy of Lost Vacuum. We have to pitch a card in our hand away into the Lost Zone, but then we send a Pokemon tool or Stadium into the Lost Zone. Out of all the games I'd been playing, one thing I was itching for was a way to bump Stadiums with Arven, because with Arven we can grab pretty much anything else that might be in our deck, but bumping Stadiums, especially if there's a path to the peak and play, is an effect I kind of quickly found that I wanted an out to. But getting into our Pokemon tool cards, up first we have a copy of Forest Sealstone. So of course, while it's attached to a Pokemon V, it has access to a V-Star power that allows you to search your deck for any card. And this card, in conjunction with Arven, really does enable some really powerful plays, since Arven at that point essentially says search your deck for any card and an item. You can really think of it that way. That being said, we do still have a couple of other tool cards. We have 1 copy of Choice Belt in the deck, just to do 30 more damage against Pokemon V. Most of the time, I think the 4/4 Regieleki count is fine, but VMAX plays Oricorio, or most of the time they're going to, and if they do get that down, they are going to force you to need a 4th damage modifier. And I just don't feel comfortable banking that we're always going to have 4 Regieleki VMAX in play, because we can always prize one might have to get researched away early on, so having access to Choice Belt is going to be good for those sorts of situations. And then for our last trainer card, we have 1 copy of EXP Share. Like I said, we aren't playing Flaffy, we aren't playing Raihan, and being able to ensure that we can keep chaining our energy turn after Pokemon get knocked out is very important for the deck. EXP Share says if your active is knocked out, you can take a basic energy from that Pokemon and move it to the Pokemon that EXP Share is attached to. And then to round out our deck list today, we have 14 copies of basic lightning energy. I know this might look like a lot at a glance, but this deck kind of lives and dies by how consistent your electricity generators are going to work. And honestly, I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to play even 15 or 16 lightning energy. But 14 definitely feels like a bit of a sweet spot. I really don't think I'd want to go much lower than this at all. So that's where I'm at right now with Miraidon EX. If there is any issue this archetype has, it's really just that you don't have the bench space for other consistency boosting Pokemon. But as long as you're able to just keep chaining your draw supporters every turn, this deck really does feel very strong, since you have one-shot potential against pretty much any deck in the format, and with the Klefkis, you actually do have an out against Lost Box, which otherwise would probably be a pretty miserable matchup. But I definitely want to hear from you guys as well. What do you think about this deck list we looked at today? Are there any cards you would change? And like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, if you do want some bonus Miraidon content, I did drop that exclusive article on Patreon detailing some additional ways you can build this deck. But with that being said, if you guys did enjoy today's video, remember to leave a like. And if you are feeling a little bit extra generous and do want to take that support to the next level, like I mentioned, you can become a patron, or you can pick up some merch over at rarecandytcg.com. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.